This ebook is brought to you by Egenvard 1998. Biography of Sigmund Freud. From ancient history to the present time, people have searched for some magic panacea or potion to lessen pain or to enhance performance. One such search was conducted by a young, ambitious physician who came to believe that he had discovered a drug that had all sorts of wonderful properties. Hearing that the drug had been used successfully to energize soldiers suffering from near exhaustion, this physician decided to try it on patients, colleagues, and friends. If the drug worked as well as he expected, he might gain the fame to which he aspired. After learning of the drug's successful use in heart disease, nervous exhaustion, addiction to alcohol and morphine, and several other psychological and physiological problems, the doctor decided to try the drug on himself. He was quite pleased with the results. To him, the drug had a pleasant aroma and an unusual effect on the lips and mouth. More importantly, however, was the drug's therapeutic effect on his serious depression. In a letter to his fiancée whom he had not seen in a year, he reported that during his last severe depression, he had taken small quantities of the drug with marvelous results. He wrote that the next time he saw her he would be like a wild man, feeling the effects of the drug. He also told his fiancée that he would give her small amounts of the drug, ostensibly to make her strong and to help her gain weight. The young doctor wrote a pamphlet extolling the benefits of the drug, but he had not yet completed the necessary experiments on the drug's value as an analgesic. Impatient to be near his fiancée, he delayed completion of his experiments and went off to see her. During that visit, a colleague and not he completed the experiments, published the results, and gained the recognition the young doctor had hoped for himself. These events took place in 1884, the drug was cocaine, the young doctor was Sigmund Freud. Freud was born either on March 6 or May 6, 1856, in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. Freud was the firstborn child of Jacob and Amalie Nathanson Freud, although his father had two grown sons, Emmanuel and Philip, from a previous marriage. Jacob and Amalie Freud had 7 other children within 10 years. But Sigmund remained the favorite of his young, indulgent mother, which may have partially contributed to his lifelong self-confidence. A scholarly, serious-minded youth, Freud did not have a close friendship with any of his younger siblings. He did, however, enjoy a warm, indulgent relationship with his mother, leading him in later years to observe that the mother-son relationship was the most perfect, the most free from ambivalence of all human relationships. When Sigmund was 3, the two Freud families left Freiburg. Emmanuel's family and Philip moved to England, and the Jacob Freud family moved first to Leipzig and then to Vienna. The Austrian capital remained Sigmund Freud's home for nearly 80 years, until 1938 when the Nazi invasion forced him to emigrate to London, where he died on September 23, 1939. When Freud was about a year and a half old, his mother gave birth to a second son, Julius, an event that was to have a significant impact on Freud's psychic development. Sigmund was filled with hostility toward his younger brother and harbored an unconscious wish for his death. When Julius died at 6 months of age, Sigmund was left with feelings of guilt at having caused his brother's death. When Freud reached middle age, he began to understand that his wish did not actually cause his brother's death and that children often have a death wish for a younger sibling. This discovery purged Freud of the guilt he had carried into adulthood and by his own analysis, contributed to his later psychic development. Freud was drawn into medicine, not because he loved medical practice, but because he was intensely curious about human nature. He entered the University of Vienna Merkel School with no intention of practicing medicine. Instead, he preferred teaching and doing research in physiology, which he continued even after he graduated from the university's Physiological Institute. Freud might have continued this work indefinitely had it not been for 2 factors. First, he believed, probably with some justification, that, as a Jew, his opportunities for academic advancement would be limited. Second, his father, who helped finance his Merkel school expense, became less able to provide monetary aid. Reluctantly, Freud turned from his laboratory to the practice of medicine. He worked for 3 years in the General Hospital of Vienna, becoming familiar with the practice of various branches of medicine, including psychiatry and nervous diseases. In 1885, he received a traveling grant from the University of Vienna and decided to study in Paris with the famous French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. He spent 4 months with Charcot, from whom he learned the hypnotic technique for treating hysteria, a disorder typically characterized by paralysis or the improper functioning of certain parts of the body. Through hypnosis, Freud became convinced of a psychogenic and sexual origin of hysterical symptoms. While still a medical student, Freud developed a close professional association and a personal friendship with Joseph Breuer, a well-known Viennese physician 14 years older than Freud and a man of considerable scientific reputation. Breuer taught Freud about catharsis, the process of removing hysterical symptoms through talking them out. While using catharsis, Freud gradually and laboriously discovered the free association technique, which soon replaced hypnosis as his principal therapeutic technique. From as early as adolescence, Freud literally dreamed of making a monumental discovery and achieving fame. On several occasions during the 1880s and 1890s he believed he was on the verge of such a discovery. His first opportunity to gain recognition came in 1884 to 1885 and involved his experiments with cocaine, which we discussed in the opening vignette. Freud's second opportunity for achieving some measure of fame came in 1886 after he returned from Paris, where he had learned about male hysteria from Charcot. He assumed that this knowledge would gain him respect and recognition from the Imperial Society of Physicians of Vienna, whom he mistakenly believed would be impressed by the young Dr. Freud's knowledge of male hysteria. Early physicians had believed that hysteria was strictly a female disorder because the very word had the same origins as uterus and was the result of a wandering womb, with the uterus traveling throughout women's bodies and causing various parts to malfunction. However, by 1886, when Freud presented a paper on male hysteria to the society, most physicians present were already familiar with the illness and knew that it could also be a male disorder. Because originality was expected and because Freud's paper was a rehash of what was already known, the Viennese physicians did not respond well to the presentation. Also, Freud's constant praise of Charcot, a Frenchman, cooled the Viennese physicians to his talk. Unfortunately, in his autobiographical study, Freud told a very different story, claiming that his lecture was not well received because members of the learned society could not fathom the concept of male hysteria. Freud's account of this incident, now known to be in error, was nevertheless perpetuated for years, and as Soloway argued, it is but one of many fictions created by Freud and his followers to mythologize psychoanalysis and to make a lonely hero of its founder. Disappointed in his attempts to gain fame and afflicted with feelings, both justified and otherwise, of professional opposition due to his defense of cocaine and his belief in the sexual origins of neuroses, Freud felt the need to join with a more respected colleague. He turned to Breuer, with whom he had worked while still a medical student and with whom he enjoyed a continuing personal and professional relationship. Breuer had discussed in detail with Freud the case of Anna O., a young woman Freud had never met, but whom Breuer had spent many hours treating for hysteria several years earlier. Because of his rebuff by the Imperial Society of Physicians and his desire to establish a reputation for himself, Freud urged Breuer to collaborate with him in publishing an account of Anna O. and several other cases of hysteria. Breuer, however, was not as eager as the younger and more revolutionary Freud to publish a full treatise on hysteria built on only a few case studies. He also could not accept Freud's notion that childhood sexual experiences were the source of adult hysteria. Finally, and with some reluctance, Breuer agreed to publish with Freud's studies on hysteria. In this book, Freud introduced the term psychical analysis, and during the following year, he began calling his approach psychoanalysis. At about the time Studies on Hysteria was published, Freud and Breuer had a professional disagreement and became estranged personally. Freud then turned to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, a Berlin physician who served as a sounding board for Freud's newly developing ideas. Freud's letters to Fliess constitute a first-hand account of the beginnings of psychoanalysis and reveal the embryonic stage of Freudian theory. Freud and Fliess had become friends in 1887, but their relationship became more intimate following Freud's break with Breuer. During the late 1890s, Freud suffered both professional isolation and personal crises. He had begun to analyze his own dreams, and after the death of his father in 1896, he initiated the practice of analyzing himself daily. Although his self-analysis was a lifetime labor, it was especially difficult for him during the late 1890s. During this period, Freud regarded himself as his own best patient. In August of 1897, he wrote to Fliess, "The chief patient I am preoccupied with is myself. The analysis is more difficult than any other. It is, in fact, what paralyzes my psychic strength." The second personal crisis was his realization that he was now middle-aged and had yet to achieve the fame he so passionately desired. During this time he had suffered yet another disappointment in his attempt to make a major scientific contribution. Again he believed himself to be on the brink of an important breakthrough with his discovery that neuroses have their etiology in a child's seduction by a parent. Freud likened this finding to the discovery of the source of the Nile. However, in 1897 he abandoned the seduction theory and once again had to postpone the discovery that would propel him to greatness. Why did Freud abandon his once treasured seduction theory? In a letter dated September 21, 1897, to Wilhelm Fliess, he gave 4 reasons why he could no longer believe in his seduction theory. First, he said, the seduction theory had not enabled him to successfully treat even a single patient. Second, a great number of fathers, including his own, would have to be accused of sexual perversion because hysteria was quite common even among Freud's siblings. Third, Freud believed that the unconscious mind could probably not distinguish reality from fiction, a belief that later evolved into the Oedipus complex. And fourth, he found that the unconscious memories of advanced psychotic patients almost never revealed early childhood sexual experiences. After abandoning his seduction theory and with no Oedipus complex to replace it, Freud sank even more deeply into his midlife crisis. Freud's official biographer, Ernest Jones, believed that Freud suffered from a severe psychoneurosis during the late 1890s, although Max Schur, Freud's personal physician during the final decade of his life, contended that his illness was due to a cardiac lesion aggravated by addiction to nicotine. Peter Gay suggested that during the time immediately after his father's death, Freud relived his Oedipal conflicts with peculiar ferocity. But Henry Ellenberger described this period in Freud's life as a time of creative illness, a condition characterized by depression, neurosis, psychosomatic ailments, and an intense preoccupation with some form of creative activity. In any event, at midlife, Freud was suffering from self-doubts, depression, and an obsession with his own death. Despite these difficulties, Freud completed his greatest work, Interpretation of Dreams, during this period. This book, finished in 1899, was an outgrowth of his self-analysis, much of which he had revealed to his friend Wilhelm Fliess. The book contained many of Freud's own dreams, some disguised behind fictitious names. Almost immediately after the publication of Interpretation of Dreams, his friendship with Fliess began to cool, eventually to rupture in 1903. This breakup paralleled Freud's earlier estrangement from Breuer, which took place almost immediately after they had published studies on hysteria together. It was also a harbinger of his breaks with Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and several other close associates. Why did Freud have difficulties with so many former friends? Freud himself answered this question, stating that it is not the scientific differences that are so important, it is usually some other kind of animosity, jealousy, or revenge, that gives the impulse to enmity. The scientific differences come later. Although Interpretation of Dreams had not created the instant international stir Freud had hoped, it eventually gained for him the fame and recognition he had sought. In the 5-year period following its publication, Freud, now filled with renewed self-confidence, wrote several important works that helped solidify the foundation of psychoanalysis, including On Dreams, written because interpretation of dreams had failed to capture much interest, Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which introduced the world to Freudian slips, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which established sex as the cornerstone of psychoanalysis, and Jokes and their relation to the unconscious, which proposed that jokes, like dreams and Freudian slips, have an unconscious meaning. These publications helped Freud attain some local prominence in scientific and medical circles. In 1902, Freud invited a small group of somewhat younger Viennese physicians to meet in his home to discuss psychological issues. Then, in the fall of that year, these 5 men, Freud, Alfred Adler, Wilhelm Stekel, Max Kahane, and Rudolf Reitler, formed the Wednesday Psychological Society, with Freud as discussion leader. In 1908, this organization adopted a more formal name, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. In 1910, Freud and his followers founded the International Psychoanalytic Association with Carl Jung of Zurich as president. Freud was attracted to Jung because of his keen intellect and also because he was neither Jewish nor Viennese. Between 1902 and 1906, all 17 of Freud's disciples had been Jewish, and Freud was interested in giving psychoanalysis a more cosmopolitan flavor. Although Jung was a welcome addition to the Freudian circle and had been designated as the Crown Prince and the man of the future, he, like Adler and Stekel before him, eventually quarreled bitterly with Freud and left the psychoanalytic movement. The seeds of disagreement between Jung and Freud were probably sown when the two men, along with Sandor Ferenczi, traveled to the United States in 1909 to deliver a series of lectures at Clark University near Boston. To pass the time during their travels, Freud and Jung interpreted each other's dreams, a potentially explosive practice that eventually led to the end of their relationship in 1913. The years of World War I were difficult for Freud. He was cut off from communication with his faithful followers, his psychoanalytic practice dwindled, his home was sometimes without heat, and he and his family had little food. After the war, despite advancing years and pain suffered from 33 operations for cancer of the mouth, he made important revisions in his theory. The most significant of these were the elevation of aggression to a level equal to that of the sexual denve, the inclusion of repression as one of the defenses of the ego, and his attempt to clarify the female Oedipus complex, which he was never able to completely accomplish. Above all, Freud was a sensitive, passionate person who had the capacity for intimate, almost secretive friendships. Most of these deeply emotional relationships came to an unhappy end, and Freud often felt persecuted by his former friends and regarded them as enemies. He seemed to have needed both types of relationship. In Interpretation of Dreams, Freud both explained and predicted the succession of interpersonal ruptures. My emotional life has always insisted that I should have an intimate friend and a hated enemy. I have always been able to provide myself afresh with both. Until he was well past 50, all these relationships were with men. Interestingly, Freud, the man who seemed to be constantly thinking of sex, had a very infrequent sex life himself. After Anna, his youngest child, was born in 1895, Freud, not yet 40 years old, had no sexual intercourse for several years. Much of his sparse sexual life stemmed from his belief that use of a condom, coitus interruptus, as well as masturbation were unhealthy sexual practices. Because Freud wanted no more children after Anna was born, sexual abstinence was his only alternative. In addition to balancing his emotional life between an intimate friend and a hated enemy, Freud possessed an outstanding talent as a writer, a gift that helped him become a leading contributor to 20th-century thought. He was a master of the German tongue and knew several other languages. Although he never won the coveted Nobel Prize for Science, he was awarded the Goethe Prize for Literature in 1930. Freud also possessed intense intellectual curiosity, unusual moral courage, demonstrated by his daily self-analysis, extremely ambivalent feelings toward his father and other father figures, a tendency to hold grudges disproportionate to the alleged offense, a burning ambition Especially during his earlier years, strong feelings of isolation even while surrounded by many followers, and an intense and somewhat irrational dislike of America and Americans, an attitude that became more intense after his trip to the United States in 1909. Why did Freud have such a disdain for Americans? Perhaps the most important reason is that he rightly believed Americans would trivialize psychoanalysis by trying to make it popular. In addition, he had several experiences during his trip to the United States that were foreign to a proper bourgeois Viennese gentleman. Even before he embarked on the George Washington, he saw his name misspelled as Freund on the passenger list. A number of other events, some of which seem almost humorous, made Freud's visit more unpleasant than it might have been. First, Freud experienced chronic indigestion and diarrhea throughout his visit, probably because the drinking water did not agree with him. In addition, he found it both peculiar and problematic that American cities did not provide public restrooms on streetcorners, and with his chronic indigestion he was frequently in search of a public lavatory. Also, several Americans addressed him as Doc or Sigmund while challenging him to defend his theories, and one person tried unsuccessfully, of course, to prevent him from smoking a cigar in a non-smoking area. Moreover, when Freud, Ferenczi, and Jung went to a private camp in western Massachusetts, they were greeted by a barrage of flags of Imperial Germany, despite the fact that none of them was German and each had reasons to dislike Germany. Also at camp, Freud, along with the others, sat on the ground while the host grilled steaks over charcoal, a custom Freud deemed to be both savage and uncouth. Subscribe for more.